My name is Choy, and I'm here representing the Mobilization for Climate Justice West. I also work for the Environmental Service Learning Initiative, which is a city-based environmental education program, partner program at a global exchange in San Francisco. But here I'm with MCJ.
And my name is Ananda. I'm also with MCJ, and I'm only here by virtue of the fact that Ellen invited me to come, because Ellen's kind of the main speaker here, and I sort of tagged along at the opportunity to be here and meet all of you fine folks whom I've heard about, through Aaron and others. My day job is with the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. Some of you may know it. It's a local organization that is actually part of a global network that fights waste and incineration in various communities around the world. And I also volunteer with the Rising Tide North America Collective, which is a volunteer-run climate activist network around the US. So
we were asked today to come to talk about what MCJ is, what we've been doing, and what is kind of coming up for us. And in the context of talking to you about how possibly you might be able to plug into some of the actions that we're going to be throwing in the future too. So we decided we'd do kind of a parallel talk where I would talk a little bit specifically about MCJ specific actions and a little bit of our history, and Ananda will give a little bit more of the context politically, nationally, and internationally. If that's okay with you guys. Okay.
And Chris's excellent presentation and pitch here was a great segue, because I think what's really important is ultimately what all of you do, what Chris does, and the local tangible issues that we can actually deal with that ultimately at the end of the day will bring us to those global solutions that we all strive for. So to begin, we talked about starting at the global level, and I won't go into great detail because all of you are energy activists, and so you know a fair amount about what's happening in the climate policy arena internationally, and I'm assuming you do, but I just wanted to touch on the fact that we all know that this year the 15th Convention of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention is taking place in Copenhagen, and in the lead up to that there's a couple of meetings that are happening right now, one in Bangkok, and then the following month one in Barcelona, where all the nations are getting together, but civil society groups and corporations are also attending to sway the various political decision makers in the negotiations that are going to take place. I won't go into any great depth, but from one of the reasons the Mobilization for Climate Justice came together in the last year was that there was a widespread feeling amongst grassroots climate activists around the world that the voices of people weren't being heard or represented at these international fora. Specifically, the voices of the most impacted communities around the world. Communities some of us refer to as frontline communities like Richmond, living under the shadow of the Chevron oil refinery, or communities around the US and around the world that have to live next to big power generation facilities, coal power plants, LNG plants, and otherwise. And also communities that are on the front lines of catastrophic climate impacts, like New Orleans and low-lying island nations, and the province in India, West Bengal, where I'm from, which is probably going to be one of the first regions in the world to go underwater fairly soon. So that was one of the key reasons. And then secondly, the undue influence of corporations. While there's no representation of communities and peoples at these, or frontline communities and impacted peoples at these conferences, the huge influence of corporate lobbyists is felt by civil society. In fact, some estimates have it that corporate lobbyists outnumber civil society groups like 5 or 6 to 1. And that's not even... I think the bigger problem is that the corporate lobby track has the inside track. Civil society groups, while they're invited to participate and send delegations, for the most part, are very limited to sort of very peripheral meetings around the convention of the parties, whilst the lobbyists really set the agenda. And it's a few years ago, it was at the last Bali convention that took place. There was a bit of a head count of how many lobbyists are out there. And the oil and gas sector alone had 1,200 of the 9,000 participants. Just the oil and gas sector. The biggest actual corporate lobby sector was the carbon traders, which is a whole different story. We won't get into that here, but it really brings to, it really underscores for us what we're up against.
UN conferences or the
at the UN framework, convention, at the Convention of the Parties, and so we who knows what the numbers are going to be like in Copenhagen, but we can anticipate that those are the odds we're playing with as civil society. So I'll hand this back to Ellen, and so that was one of the reasons why MCJ came together. How do we give a voice to the grassroots movements around the world, and where policymakers are not representing our interests, how do we step up with street heat and public opposition to such compromised agendas? I'll just pass around a brochure called Deal or No Deal that some friends of ours in Europe put together, and we've just reprinted it in a North American context, so you can pass it around.
Great. So even before MCJ, there were some groups already who had been doing similar movement building. Nationally, I think that's best characterized by the Environmental Justice and Climate Change Initiatives Coalition building, and I worked with them for about a year and a half. And they were kind of pulling together groups who were working on climate, but trying to push more of an environmental justice perspective and addressing the disproportionate impacts on low-income people of color in the United States. And there are some really active groups, including the Indigenous Environmental Network. There is also an international coalition called Climate Justice Now that's been really active. But MCJ kind of came about within the past year. I think talks nationally and locally started earlier this year. And this is when climate was becoming a lot more apparent that it was affecting a larger range of justice issues and not just environmental justice, but that it was actually intersecting almost every justice, civil society sector in the country and internationally. From labor to food justice, just general racial justice groups. So nationally, the mobilization for climate justice, I think, was just more conversations in the beginning of the year. You might know a little bit better. But here in the West Coast, in the Bay Area, we actually started meeting earlier in, February, March? Having these discussions, trying to pull together, like what Ananda said, but a coalition of groups who were interested in putting the frontline, disproportionately impacted communities at the forefront of the climate debate, and amplifying that voice, and then coupling that with the belief that corporate domination shouldn't be present in the policy arenas here in the U.S., also internationally in the UN debate. So we came together to try to build a very grassroots local coalition, defining our own climate priorities from our perspective. And we were built really on a lot of common principles and goals, and generally I've already said them. And we have some more listed out on the handout, which I gave you a little bit more in detail, and that's a little just debrief about who we are, as well as our member organizations. And we started small, but we've grown pretty large in the past year. We have 35 members now. They're all Bay Area based, most of them community-based organizations, all grassroots. And in that conversation about what MCJ's principles are, we also chose a very localized target in our, at least, Bay Area-based actions. We chose Chevron enrichment. Of course, there's a lot of local struggles that we could have chosen in the Bay Area. You know, West Oakland, like it was mentioned before, Baby Hunters Point is still dealing with some environmental justice issues, but we chose Chevron enrichment. And so the conversation started about having the idea of a climate camp, which is a national, maybe international movement, I think, of camps that were built of just their climate training empowerment camps for activists who are interested in getting trainings on climate change, climate justice, community-based solutions. So the first conversations were about how can we pull together community-based groups, put them in the front of our organizing, and then create this climate camp where we can invite Richmond residents and then open it also up to the general Bay Area public